Hey everyone, my name is Gio and I'll be hosting this episode of the Red Nation podcast. Today's episode is going to be focusing on the current situation in Guatemala. Recently, thousands of protesters hit the streets starting on Saturday, November 21st, after the Guatemalan Congress passed a budget that would reduce funding for human rights, as well as health programs such as those which fight malnutrition, as well as increasing funding for Congress people's meals and expenses. This is all within the context of the pandemic, and after Guatemala suffered two hurricanes, Eta and Iota, which has devastated different parts of the country, especially indigenous communities. Today, we're going to be joined by three very special guests. The first is Andrea Ishu, who's going to be speaking about the current protests taking place in Guatemala and what the responses of the government has been. Second, we'll hear from Dr. Florida Lopez, who will be speaking about detained activists in Xela being the second largest city in Guatemala after Guatemala City. And third, we'll hear about the current situation in the Ixil region by Dr. Alejandro Flores, who's currently there, and he'll provide an update as to how indigenous communities and others have been responding to the current political and environmental situation. In 1954, the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz was overthrown by the Guatemalan oligarchs with the assistance of the CIA and the US government. This would eventually lead to a 36-year civil war, which officially lasted between 1960 to 1996. According to a United Nations Truth Commission report, 200 people died during the war. 83% of them were indigenous, and the military was responsible for 93% of these deaths. The military also committed 626 massacres during this time period. 1.5 million people were displaced. Guatemala is also characterized by a very corrupt Guatemalan government. Previous presidents such as Alvaro Colom or Otto Perez Molina, along with other ex-high-ranking government officials such as former vice presidents and ministers, have been implicated in corruption. Former Guatemalan President Jimmy Morales, for instance, was being accused of corruption by a UN watchdog group known as CICIG. As a result, Morales used very violent tactics in order to expel CICIG from the country. Now today, the current president, Alejandro Jamatei, and his allies are being implicated in corruption. All right, so for our first guest, we have a really amazing compañera. Her name is Andrea Ishui. So to begin, Andrea, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience who are listening to us right now?
Thank you, Giovanni. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrea Ishui. I'm a human rights defender, Mayan activist, journalist. I'm a Quiche woman from Highlands in Totonicapan.
Great, thank you for that introduction. So to start off, could you just tell us what's going on in Guatemala today? We know that here in the media, sometimes we get a very simplistic picture of what's going on in Guatemala. People were hitting the streets this past weekend, and we saw images of the police repressing protesters. So could you just tell us what's going on in Guatemala today? What is the current state of the country given the pandemic and obviously the hurricanes Eta and Iota? So could you just kind of inform us as to what's going on in the ground level?
So what's going on in Guatemala right now? Everywhere in the world have seen this picture of Guatemalan Congress in flames. This is the top of the iceberg. Guatemala has been in a long crisis for many years ago, but what everybody is seeing in the newspapers, in the social media is basically all the rage of a country and their people that is basically sick and tired of all the corruption, all the violence and dispossession that the Guatemalan state has been part of. In the past, November 21st was a big mobilization occurring in Guatemala City, where a lot of people mobilized because they were angry by the way of the Guatemalan government had been administrating the COVID crisis, the way they haven't react by the affections of these storms and hurricanes Eta and Iota that has affected thousands of families. The people was mad because there was some arrangements made by Guatemalan President Alejandro Jamatei done with the National Congress, basically to spend all the public money and give more money to the military forces and to build this new place for the Guatemalan Congress. When there is this pandemic crisis where thousands of people doesn't have access to healthcare, and also all the effects of the storms and hurricanes Iota and ETA. And we're looking at how all the countries flooded, how all the Ixil and Quechí regions in the communities of Cobán, Quiché, and all the northern side of Guatemala are basically living the affections of all these storms. A lot of the communities has lost their lands. A lot of the communities lost their harvests, and this is like something really, really awful happening right now. And also how this Congress are basically approving this millionaire budget. So the people was really, really mad and angry because there are different reasons to be. So in a lot of the urban areas, and especially during pandemic times, there was a lot of repression. There was a lot of people put into prison because they were outside on the streets during the state of siege. There was cut-offs from a lot of the public offices. There was not enough social service offices and social care. So there's a lot of people unemployed, and some people are employed but not receiving their salaries because a lot of the companies are justifying that because of the economical crisis that was coming with the COVID, they needed to save and also to cut some of their resources. So that justification has allow a lot of human rights violations against a lot of the people in Guatemala. So this is a lot of things going on, and looking at the building of the Congress being burning, it's like just some top of the iceberg. It's just a symbolic gesture of all the rage that has been accumulated in Guatemala's communities.
Thank you for that concise explanation of what's going on in Guatemala. Could you talk a little bit about who is protesting at the moment, what organizations are involved, and what's the role of indigenous peoples? So today, which is Tuesday, November 24th, when we're doing this interview, we know that the ancestral authorities from Totonicapán, 48 cantones, and the Xinca authorities were in the plaza today. So we're seeing different actors. Could you speak about who's mobilizing, who's organizing?
Yes. Well, in Saturday, 21st, there was a lot of urban collectives, youth movement, peasant organizations, some religious organizations too, part of a big social movement in Guatemala of civil society. And today there was all these indigenous authorities from Totonicapán, Solola, and the Xinca communities. So there is, and also the Indigenous Council of Indigenous Authorities and Ancestral Indigenous Governments gathered with Totonicapán, Solola, and the Xinca Parliament to join their actions and also to demand some structural reforms. So in the Saturday, I was listening the people saying it's not just this budget, it's also the economical crisis, it's also the way you manage the pandemic crisis, it's also all the different ways where the national government has been stealing the public money for private interests. And today, while I was listening to the demands of the indigenous authorities, they were saying that it is really important to take back all this budget, to not put the country in more debt. And also the indigenous communities were saying that there was really important to rethink our political pact. They were talking about the necessity of reforming the constitution with a plurinational assembly that basically can make that the ways that we organize, the political ways that we organize as a country can reflect the diversity that we are. So it's really important to see how these different ways of organizing and mobilizing are taking the streets in different places of Guatemala. In Saturday, for example, a lot of the main capitals were also mobilizing. At the same time that the people was taking the streets in Guatemala City, there was people in Quetzaltenango, in Coban, in Huehuetenango. There are also regions of Guatemala that had suffered from all the corruption and dispossession that the local authorities have done. So it's really important to see how the energy and the strength of the indigenous authorities has also come to the city to say we are also affected by the same also ways of dispossession. The indigenous communities have more than 500 years resisting this model of a national state that has dispossessed us from our land, from our communal ways of organizing. So it's really interesting to see the possibility of also mobilizing for the necessity of structural changes. So it's really good to see that this the diverse movement that is coming to the streets right now.
So one of the things that we also see in the media right now, for instance, we see people getting dragged by police officers. I think there was news today that at least 2 protesters lost their eyes and things like that. So could you speak a little bit about the responses of the government to these protests, or speak about the types of violences that they've committed against people who are speaking up against the government?
Yes, they want to evade their responsibility. They are avoiding their responsibility. Today also some of the opposition members of Congress basically sit the Ministry of Gobernación, we call him, which is the one that is in charge of the security and the national security. And he said that he was going to investigate inside his own institution to see the cops that basically violate human rights. But we know that in this kind of structures, they do not function while they're not receiving orders. So we know that the order to basically repress the mobilization, that basically criminalize the protesters, was an order made by the national president and also by its minister of security. So we are expecting that they can resign because the police brutality was really awful to see. And that's true too. Like in the police officers basically shot people with the tear gases, with also some rubber bullets, and that's the reason why two people right now have lost their left eyes. So it's something that we also saw in the repression made by the government in the state in Chile. So you can see how these strategies of terror are part of the militarized way of repressing the social movements, the right to protest. And it's not only happening in Guatemala, we saw that also in the United States, where when the Black Lives Matter movement were taking the streets also. So these ways that the governments use their violence are legitimized and also justified by other patrons, more like huge of exclusion and systemical displacement and dispossession of the communities. So these ways of using the violence against the protest of the people is something that we in the indigenous communities have seen since the national government and since Guatemala was born. So for us, it's not new, but it's something that a lot of people in the urban areas in Guatemala is like looking at the first time and living it at the first time, which is really awful. So it was really unproportionate, and also because of all the dangers that the people that is mobilizing in the street is taking in the middle of a pandemic moment, because the COVID pandemic hasn't ended. We don't have a proper treatment for the people, and the deaths of contagion by COVID are also really, really high. So we see this like way of using the violence and the pandemic as a a way of terrorizing all the population, and also a way of creating narratives that criminalize the right to protest and to mobilize. We were following some cases, and there were more than 41 people that was arrested on Saturday in Guatemala City. 4 people more were arrested in Shela. 1 people was arrested in Huehuetenango, and many of them has been criminalized, and some of them had been sent to trial because they had been accused of the burning of the Congress, or that they attacked the local authorities because they were just defending other people that was being attacked. And that's a constant. So there is a lot of repression right now, and the criminalization of a lot of the people that was there mobilizing for their rights.
Thank you. I think it's important to also note that the resistance that we're seeing in the capital right now in Guatemala City. I mean, like you said, indigenous peoples have been resisting for the last 500 years. It's also important to note, like you're mentioning, the politics of terror that the Guatemalan state employs in order to repress indigenous communities. So could you speak a little bit about the legacies of the Guatemalan Civil War, and then even cases like the massacre that occurred in Totonicapan in 2012, where people rose up and they were met with repression under President Otto Perez Melina. So could you speak a little bit about that, and even how we remember that 2012 massacre that occurred?
Yes, basically, Guatemala has a long heritage from war practices and repression. There was a lot of military governments that were basically leading Guatemala from 1954, where there was a political coup, also supported by the US government in Guatemala, that took down a progressist government led by Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. And that basically opened up the doors for really intense repressive times for Guatemala that basically took more than 200,000 lives of people that was accused of different crimes, and their deaths were justified in the middle of a narrative that was claiming the Cold War. And basically they were using as a justification that if you were a communist, you have to die because you were an enemy of the state. So what we see right now in the way that the violence is still used in Guatemala is a direct legacy of that politics of war that was implemented during the war in Guatemala. Something that is also part of that is that all these war crimes haven't been all judged and also paid by the criminals, and also a lot of the former military people that was in charge of the military operations of repression during the war are right now higher officers that has been in power. For example, Otto Perez Molina, he was a military that was in charge of one of the military bases in the Ixil region, and he was in charge of that area while the genocide was being perpetrated by the military forces against the communities. And then he was ascended. He was one of the militaries that was present on the firm of the peace accords. And then he became a Guatemalan president in 2012. And in the first 10 months of his government, he basically massacred people in Totonicapan, in San Juan Zacatepeques, in La Puya, in a lot of regions that were basically resisting and putting their opposition to the implementation of extractive projects. So we are looking how that model, how that path of state violence has continued. And in this moment, as we speak, we can say that Guatemala signed their peace agreements more than 20 years ago. But the structural causes of that conflict, of that war, hasn't changed. All the inequalities are still present in our countries. The indigenous communities are still impoverished by the national politics, by the structural racism, and also that has been disregarded by these military elites. So this repression that we're seeing, it's also part of that structure. Alejandro Jamatei was a former officer also in the government of Guatemala in between 22 and 24, and he was in charge of the prisons. And he was put into jail, and also he was having a legal case against him because of the violation of human rights and extrajudicial killings, because during his mandate, there was a lot of massacres perpetrated against the prisoners in Guatemalan prisons. So there is all this relation of this way of organizing and also the institutionalization of terror, and how it is part of the repressive practices in the daily lives of the people, and especially in the way that the local authorities organize and administrate violence. So there are a lot of consequences around the war that also are related with the war crimes, and where all these dead people or the massacred communities or the big victims in their majority were from indigenous communities. So what we lived in Guatemala in 2012, when Otto Perez Molina arrived into power, but was basically also these ways of organizing the violence against the communities, and also criminalizing the protest and targeting the indigenous communities as an enemy of the state, because indigenous communities are opposed to this extractive model that is putting the money above life. And something that was really for me dramatic to see was how all this discourse of develop was used to justify a massacre against people. So what we are seeing also is that there is also a relationship of the state violence with the arrival of foreign extractive companies, because after the signing of the peace accords in 96, in 97, the arrival of these foreign companies become more aggressive, and was also the justification of repression by saying that the communities that were opposing to these development projects were enemies of the states. So there is a relationship of the way that the government criminalizes the people that defend their rights, their territories, and also the reaction of the local power elites that has also increased the harassment and violence against the human rights defenders, the indigenous communities, the leaders, the indigenous authorities, and journalists. We have seen also in peace times how between the 2012 and the 2020, there have been more than 300 acts, 3,000 acts of criminalization against human rights defenders. So it's something that is like coming again as a repressive practice as the war. Just in 2019, there were more than 15 human rights defenders killed in Guatemala. So the militarization is part of this strategy, the criminalization also, and the way that they basically are putting leaders and indigenous authorities to irregular legal procedures for defending human rights. And there's also the complicity of the mainstream media, because there is a speech of opposition to progress and development that also leads to the terrorism used of the terrorist word as a discourse to defend the private property, and how this is used to justify aggression against the communities that defend their rights, that the people that mobilizes in the streets. So there is a category that was created by Guatemalan state during the war that was the internal enemy, and that basically targeted every people and every community that was in a way opposing to the acts of the government as an enemy and as a threat to the state. And that was also used to criminalize and to perpetuate genocide against Mayan communities. So we're seeing how right now in the government speech about the mobilizations and around the march that happened in November 21st, there was also the use of terrorist as a category, as a word to criminalize the people that was in front of the Congress, that was mobilizing on the streets, in a way to target them as an internal enemy. So that's part of like all this legacy of the war that we are living.
Thank you for that good explanation of that historical violence that the Guatemalan state employs and how that looks like today. I kind of wanted to finish up with two more questions, but will there be more protests in Guatemala against the state? Is there, my understanding is there's some protests scheduled for Saturday in a couple of days.
Yes, this 25 of November, all the women's and feminist movements are calling to the streets too, because in November 21st, we also commemorate the International Day against violence, violence against women. And also because we saw how on Saturday, the repressive practices of the police was also really brutal against women. So the movement is calling to the streets in this 25, and also a lot of other organizations are calling to be on the streets on the 26th and the 27th, and also to be again on the Saturday 28 in a big mobilization too. And we are expecting more and more actions happening, because today the national government refused to meet with the indigenous representatives and the indigenous authorities. And also the local authorities said that if the national government didn't hear the demands of the indigenous communities, they will be calling for more mobilization. So we are expecting at least 2 more weeks of intense mobilizations all around Guatemala.
Thanks for that update. I had two final questions. The first one is, what future do you imagine for Guatemala? As we kind of heard from you right now, it seems like the reality is pretty grim in terms of the Guatemalan state and its repressive tactics. But we also think about these long forms of resistance, the last 500 years. So I guess to wrap it up, what future do you imagine for Guatemala? And also, what message do you have for people listening? How can people support protesters and people in Guatemala and these struggles from abroad? So I kind of wanted to leave you with those kind of final thoughts for this interview.
Yes. Well, we were using this hashtag these past days that we say no nos pela, where basically we're putting some of the demands that we are making to the local authorities, and also we're saying that there are the necessities that we see urgent right now, because the indignation of the people, it's also really close of what we are living daily. So we want to change everything, and we have some ideas to initiate with that. And we're saying that we want the resignation of the president, of the people in Congress, of the local cabinet that includes all the ministers, because they have been looting us, they have been dispossessing us, they have been using the public money to become richer. And in this current political crisis, is really a crime to see how they are using the public money and stealing the money that the people needs to basically have attention in the hospitals, because people is infected with COVID and other diseases, and how they are denying support for the communities that are facing all the affections of the storms Eta and Iota, and also how it's part of this structural way of corruption that it's are also lead with the CACIF. So we are demanding also the private companies, the political and economical chambers in Guatemala, that they need to stop stealing our future, because there is orchestrated the way that they act, and they use the military forces to criminalize our struggle, and also to keep doing business from Guatemala's people dispossession. We want freedom from all the political prisoners and stop the state violence, because a lot of arbitrary detentions happened this past weekend, and we want them to be released. We don't want more criminalizations against activists, against protesters, against people that was organizing and mobilizing to show their anger, their rage, and the way that we're really tired and sick of the way that the government is acting. We want the end of the political persecution of the people that are dissenting. And we also want a structural change. A lot of the indigenous organizations, the indigenous authorities, and people that are being on the streets for many years had said that there is important to change the structure of this corrupt state, and there is a necessity of a plurinational constitute assembly. So it's really important to say that, because the Guatemala is not living in a democracy. We are just saying how people is taking the Congress and also the presidency by basically seal a product. We don't see our democracy as something that is legitimized with the communities that represent the diversity that we are having and that we are. So it's the necessity of changing the way that we organize in a political way, but also the necessity of changing our ethical references, and also to talk about the necessity of changing the structures that are also exterminating the life on our planet, because this political model, it's also accompanied by this economical model that has put the money over the life, and where we see in all the extinction of the diversity of ecosystems, not just in Guatemala, but it's something that it's really important. So talking about a new constitution, it's something that also comes of a process of paradigm shift, because we need structural changes that also comes from changing the ways that we exist in these territories, the necessity of existing without destructing the life on earth, and also the urgent necessity that the indigenous voices are at the center of this defense of the life.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrea, for taking time out of your day to speak with me today. I think you provide, different aspects of what's going on in Guatemala today. So thank you so much. Thank you also for your work in organizing in Guatemala and really trying to build towards a better future. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Giovanni. Take care too.
All right, so for our next guest, we have a very dear friend of mine. Her name is Dr. Florida Lopez. So to start off, Flori, could you introduce yourself to everyone who's listening right now?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having me, Giovanni. I appreciate the opportunity to just engage in the conversation alongside you and the other speakers. So my name is Florida Lopez. I was born in La Capital of Guatemala, and I came to the US when I was 2.5 years old. When I came to the US, I came to South Central Los Angeles. But my family is actually originally from Shela. And we are Quiche, but that's very much part of how we understand ourselves and how we relate to Shela as a place. And I'm also an assistant professor at the UCLA Chicano and Central American Studies Department.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. So Xela is actually the second largest city in Guatemala after Guatemala City. So Flori, right now the media is portraying Guatemala as a site where there's a lot of protests and things like that. Some of the images that we've seen is protesters being brutally repressed by police forces in the Guatemalan state. We saw the Congress burning. Could you tell us a little bit about what's going on outside of Guatemala City? So a lot of the photographs and the information we're getting is from the capital, but what's going on in places like in Xela, and other smaller cities. So if you could speak to that and why people are protesting.
Yeah, so I think I'll start with the second question first, right? So why are people protesting? I think, the way that I understand it is really that this is a lot of layered issues that have just come together at this moment, right? So there's the combination of the pandemic, and Guatemala has been a place where multiple different cities, but smaller towns, have been experiencing hunger as a result of the lack of infrastructure in Guatemala, the lack of aid during the pandemic, right? So you saw images of different places in Guatemala with white flags outside their doors as a way to ask for help because they literally do not have enough to eat. So you combine, right, the very ineffective and inept response from the government to COVID, alongside like long-standing issues of poverty, of violence from the state. And then you throw on top of that 2 hurricanes that have devastated different parts of Guatemala. And again, the lack of aid, right? A lot of the images, the very few images we saw of people receiving aid in different places of Guatemala that were impacted by the storms, it was people who had fundraised, outside of state mechanisms. And it was other countries sometimes, or other support groups, or sometimes even the community itself having to support others in the community, right? And so you have all of that happening within the last few months, within the last couple of weeks. On top of that, right, the Congress decides to pass this budget that effectively eliminated funding for malnutrition programs, as if though Guatemala doesn't have an issue of malnutrition and hunger, especially when it comes to children, right? And I think anybody that's familiar with the reality of what it means to be poor or live in rural areas in Guatemala understands that these issues are part of an everyday struggle. And so I think for the Congress to decide to pass this budget as if though this isn't a major concern during the pandemic, and at the same time appropriate more funds for themselves and put the country into further debt by taking out loans, all of that came together and just became essentially too much for people to stand, right? And so people, despite the health consequences of COVID, have taken to the streets to say that this cannot happen anymore, right? That this president and this entire Congress does not represent us, does not have our best interests, has never had our best interests, and actually often works to basically in service of major corporations, of elite families, of people who are already wealthy. And so I think that's why people took to the streets, right? But so in Xela, like you mentioned, it's the second biggest city of Guatemala. And so I always tell people that part of what it means to be from there is that we understand our relationships to the land despite the city, right? So the city got built on top of us, but we've always been there. And so I think that's really important because in some ways, one of the things that's happened is that we still love Xela, right? It's why Xela has maintained a name that doesn't appear on the map. If you look at maps of Guatemala, it's officially called Quetzaltenango. But you talk to anybody who's from there, it's Xela. And when they say Xela, they say it with pride, right? For a lot of different reasons. So people took to the streets in Xela, and the police decided to try to repress them violently and brutally. And so I think that's one of the things that's been really concerning for me. And among those, of course, is my cousin. So I want to make sure to share his name, which is Cesar Valdo Alvarez. And, he's a young person. He's active in a lot of different spaces. And so he was one of the people who was brutalized and detained by the police. And I think, the police have really essentially used the lack of infrastructure, the lack of accountability. They really used the impunity that has remained since the Civil War right? Where police are never held accountable for what they do, no matter what they do. They've actually used all of that to try to get away with extorting people for money, right? With being criminals themselves, right? And with now trying to forcefully repress what is the right of people of Shela, which is to defend their place, right?
Yeah, so Flori, you're currently doing a fundraiser for some of the detained activists from Shela. So who are these detained activists, like your cousin? How are they? We know they got arrested a couple of days ago, but how are they doing?
That's one of the things that's really difficult because there's information that gets shared with me that I can't even share publicly because people are so afraid of being targeted by the police, right? And so in Guatemala, what it means to speak out against these institutions is risking your life, but it's also risking the life of your family. And so everything I share here, I'm sharing it, in a kind of mediated manner, right? In a careful and thoughtful manner, understanding what the reality is on the ground out there. So what I can share is that my understanding is that everybody that was detained that night was brutalized. So everybody was actually hit by the police. The physical harm ranges, right? And I'll be honest, like I haven't seen images of my cousin. I haven't seen, they said that there's video of him being detained, but I have not seen that. Partially, I don't want to ask, right? Because that's very difficult to think about for me. But I know that at least one of the people who was also detained had their ribs broken. I know another person is showing signs of possibly a concussion and maybe loss of memory. I know that there are people who were brutalized who were not detained, so they're not listed as one of the 7 people, but that does not mean that they did not face violence from the police. I think, I can't speak for every single person because part of how I've been coordinating is that I'm coordinating within the diaspora and within the networks that I operate in, and primarily communicating with my family, knowing that my family knows all of these people and has relationships with them. But what I can share, at least about my cousin, is, like I mentioned, he's a young person who is very active. And, when we were talking to him, one of the things that he said was, these are things that happen when you go out to fight for what is right. And that's both really powerful, but it also makes me angry because I'm like, no, like fighting for what is right should not result in being brutalized. That's injustice, right? And so I think I'm just really in awe at the strength that they have had to really denounce this publicly, right? My uncle has said, like, this is not going to go quietly. We're not going to be silenced by this. This is not a time for fear. This is a time to demand justice because the police cannot get away with this. And so I think that's the community that they're operating within. It's a community that has been forced into a position where they're not going to allow themselves to feel fear and to operate with fear because they have both a right, but possibly also a duty, right, to denounce this violence.
Flori, thank you for sharing that. And I think very powerful words to really reflect on and really kind of let simmer. I know this is really personal for a lot of us, and I appreciate you sharing that, especially because it is so, it's related to your family. So I thank you for sharing that with everyone who's listening. I think when we think about violence in Guatemala, and the protests and things like that, this is just one historical moment of a longer legacy of resistance from our ancestors, right? Me being Quiche Maya with roots also in Shela. So could you speak about just kind of that historical indigenous resistance, and also speaking a little bit about the genocide and discrimination and racism that Maya people, Xinca Garifuna, have also suffered, especially at the hands of the Guatemalan state?
Yeah, so for me, in a country that is majority indigenous, there is no way for this kind of moment of brutality and repression to not be tied to over 500 years of colonialism, right? Since the arrival of the Spaniards and the building of Guatemala as a quote unquote republic, what we have seen is that generation after generation, the state has always kind of been present, but only to facilitate the accumulation of wealth, right? The theft of territory. And at least here, we understand that as settler colonialism, right? That the colonizers never left. They claim to have a country in which everybody is a citizen, but not everybody gets treated that way, right? And not everybody agreed to that project to begin with. And so I think it's important to really understand this moment as part of such a longer legacy of struggle, of repression, of violence from those who have power, from those who think that we're disposable, right? My first reactions to some of the information around the budget cuts, because it's not just a budget cut, right? What the budget cut says is that you don't matter, that you're disposable, that you can die of hunger and nobody is going to bat an eye, not the people who have the power to change those structures, right? And so people know this. I think that's what people don't always understand about a place like Guatemala, is that there is a long-standing tradition of resistance as well. And I think one story that I'll share with you from my family in Shela is that I remember on one trip to Shela, my uncle was like, come see this place. I want to show you this place. And at that point, we took my nephew, who was like 16. And he took us to this field that was kind of couched between different buildings, like houses. And he made us get out of the car, and it seemed very random. We're kind of like, why are we here? But he turned to part of the field and he said, this is where the Spanish and the Quiche fought. And he turned to my nephew, like I said, who's 16, born and raised in the US, and said, this is where your grandparents fought for you to be alive. And for me, that is like the root, right? Is that we understand ourselves as part of a long, long legacy of people who have had to fight to survive. And I think that's both true during the war as a result of the genocide. And I also want to say this publicly as well, is that this year is the 40-year anniversary of when my uncle was disappeared. So in 1980, my uncle Fidel Boch, who was the youngest of his siblings, was kidnapped by a police officer in the capital city of Guatemala, and we never found him again. You fast forward 40 years later, after a supposed peace accords were signed, and now my cousin, the next generation of our family, is brutalized by a police officer. What does that tell us? It tells us that in the same way that we have a long line of resistance, the police have a long legacy of repression and violence and impunity. And I think that is why my uncle is also like, we are not going to allow this to stand. We can't allow this to continue.
Sorry again. I think just really powerful perspective and words. And I think it's really important what you're saying. And I think it's important to kind of reflect on those things. So, thinking about resistance, thinking about intergenerational struggles, and thinking about diaspora, me and yourself, we're yourself and I are both members of the Maya diaspora. So how can the Maya diaspora, how can the Guatemalan diaspora, how could other indigenous peoples across Abya Yala, or what's known as the Americas, build stronger solidarity, international networks with folks in Guatemala? How can we how can we build these relationships with our relatives in Guatemala and these social movements? So just kind of wanted to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think solidarity across borders is absolutely essential. At the same time, I don't take it for granted that we as a diaspora are purposefully not taught our history. We are not taught about US intervention. And so a lot of times when we migrate, we don't always come with a historical context, right? And that's been my experience. I didn't know all of this when I was 10, right? There were stories that I inherited about different issues, right? Like the story I shared of my uncle. Nonetheless, I didn't understand it within a historical context. So I think it's important to stand in solidarity, but I also think it's important to ensure that people have the information necessary to be able to do that, right? And so I think for me, it begins with asking questions. It begins from a position of humility and understanding that we're not there. And so we need to learn and we need to listen. And more importantly, I think, or just as importantly, we need to ask questions, right? Ask questions about why are we even here to begin with? This is not our homeland. Why did we leave, right? Why couldn't, and you know, it's interesting because my family's narrative is a little bit around like, we wanted all of you to have a better opportunity to have an education. Well, we should ask, why isn't that possible in Guatemala? Why couldn't we have an education there? And so I think it's important to ask those questions and then to remember that we can play a powerful role, right? We can play a role in publicly denouncing these things. We can play a role in building relationships with collectives and groups in our hometowns in Guatemala. We can support and uplift the work that they do, and we can learn from them. I want to share that how I found out about my cousin being detained was actually through social media. It was a post on Instagram, and I was already kind of turning in for the night. And my partner walks into the door and into the room and is like, you need to check this Instagram post because I think the police has your cousin. And it was from there that we started to text all our relatives there and try to see, you know, if anybody would see our messages and figure out next steps. What did they need, right? What could we offer? Because also, like, people don't always ask for things there, right? Sometimes you have to offer, you know, do you need financial resources? Do you need me to write a letter? Do you need me to make a phone call? Do you need me to put an action together? And I think there is no shortage of ways to stand in solidarity. I think we can demand more spaces that talk about this information, not just in schools and universities, but in our grassroots collectives that we form and are a part of here, right? Like this podcast. I think we can demand that this information be shared on social media. I think we can follow particular accounts that show really critical perspectives of history, right? And then I think we can ask ourselves, how do I support? Sometimes that support can be financial. A $20 donation to support the medical expenses of people being detained. A $30 donation to support a community that is completely flooded and has lost their harvest. And that has major repercussions. That is not just something that happened last week. It's something that will impact that community for a couple generations at least. And so I think financial resources are important. I also think sharing information is important. And I think when necessary, we need to move to action, right? We have to denounce that violence, and we have to denounce it in ways that are thoughtful. We're not going to ask for US intervention into Guatemala when the US just a few months ago was doing the same thing to people here, right around the Black Lives Matter movement, and was brutally repressing people here. And I think those are the kind of connections that we need to continue to make, right? I support abolition space here in Los Angeles, and I see it, and for me, that is grounded in the same reason why I support sovereignty in my hometown in Guatemala, right? Those issues are interlinked, and we can't be afraid to ask big questions and to really have really big visions for the future, always in conversation with others, in conversations with our elders, with the collectives that are doing the on the ground work, right? But nonetheless, we also get to play a role in shaping what happens in our homelands and uplifting the movements that are demanding justice and dignity for everyone.
Thank you, Flori. Your words are always pretty powerful for me, especially. I'm usually, after I hear you, I'm usually left pretty speechless. So thank you for sharing that. It's just really always really awesome to hear your perspective on things, and definitely resonates with me in a personal level as well. So I guess just to kind of leave with some kind of concluding thoughts, I guess I just had two questions that I asked the three kind of people I interviewed for this podcast, because I think thinking about Guatemala, thinking about our own family histories, you know, it's just, one could come out with a fatalistic viewpoint, which could also be very not progressive towards building a better future. So I think the two questions that I wanted to ask you was, one, what future do you imagine for Guatemala, and to a further extension, the Guatemalan diaspora living in Turtle Island or the US? And what message do you have for the people listening to this podcast? And how can they support protesters and people and social movements in Guatemala?
I think in terms of the future for Guatemala, I want a future where people are safe, where people are well, and where indigenous people have sovereignty and autonomy. I think those may sound like very simple things, but those are the exact aspects of life that have been denied to us as a collective, right? We do not have complete control over our lives. We don't own most of our territory, right? And I put own in air quotes. And so I think for me, when I look at the demands that are coming from collectives in Guatemala, right, the demands to end gender violence, it's because they want women to be healthy, to be alive, to be well, right? When I look at the demands to end child hunger, it's because we want our children to be well. And so I think the future that I see for Guatemala is really one in which people are able to exercise the sovereignty to the benefit of the collective, because I think that's what people have been fighting for a very long time. I think in terms of the diaspora, that's challenging, because I think we haven't always had the opportunities to build together, to be in conversation with each other. But I think for me, when I think about that question, I think what I ultimately want is for us to be good relatives to the people whose land we're on. So for me, it's, yes, always maintaining a relationship to my homelands, always understanding that that is the root for me, for my children, for any generations that come later. But I also always want to be responsive and responsible to the people whose land I'm on, which is Tongva people here in Los Angeles, because I do believe that if they have sovereignty, we're all better for it. And so that's something that I see as a future for us as a diaspora, is learning how to be good relatives to the Native nations whose land we're on all across these territories. And I think in terms of how can people support, like I mentioned, there's a lot of GoFundMes that need support right now. I started one as well for the medical and legal expenses for all those who were detained in Shela. So you can search that. It's a solidarity fund for activists in Shela. And I think in addition to that, like I mentioned before, I really think it's about figuring out who's doing critical work on the ground. And there's actually quite a few movements, right? Like I mentioned, the movements to end gender violence, right? Movements to support children's rights, movements to free political prisoners. And I think all of those are important parts of understanding what is happening in Guatemala, first and foremost, and then feeling comfortable with showing your support, right? Whether that's in social media, showing up in person. We're having an action on Saturday here in Los Angeles at Grand Park at 4 p.m. And it's both something that we decided to do because I think those in Shela need to see us be out in the streets with them, right? Even though we're in different streets, but we're out there with them. But it's also something that in some ways I think makes me really angry, because essentially what has happened as a result of police repression in Shela is that now we're all having to risk our health because of COVID, right? But it's a risk that we're willing to take, even though we understand that these are such layered issues and that actually we represent a lot of the communities that are disproportionately impacted by COVID. But nonetheless, we understand that it's important to get out there and to denounce this violence.
Well, thanks a lot, Flori, for that, those words and your wisdom and taking the time to speak to us here on this podcast. So thanks a lot, and we appreciate your time. Maltios, gracias, thank you. All right, so for our last and final guest, we have Dr. Alejandro Flores, who's currently in Neva, which forms part of the Ishu region. Alejandro, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience who's listening to us now?
Hi, Gio. Thank you very much. Yes, I am a sociologist and an anthropologist from Guatemala. I've been working for the last years in collaboration with the Ishil University as a tutor and also as professor sometimes. And we've been developing communitarian research regarding indigenous rebellions and the effects of counterinsurgency violence.
Great, thanks so much. So right now, as I was mentioning, you're currently in the Ishu region. So for the listeners who may not know a little about the Ishu region or Guatemala, could you just provide a little bit of the context of what's been going on there as of late, in terms of how people have been faring with the COVID pandemic, the two hurricanes Eta and Iota, which is still causing some damages there, and also just kind of the protests against the Guatemalan government right now. So if you could just kind of introduce a little bit about what's going on in the Ishu region right now, so our listeners could have a better sense of what's taking place at the moment.
So yeah, what we have been seeing here in the last couple of weeks is like very heavy rain that hasn't stopped. Only we had a couple of days that were a little bit sunny, but beyond that, it has been raining on the everyday basis. Sometimes a little harder, sometimes a little less hard. But the problem is that it has been consistent. And this has made some very strong damage to the soil in all these ravines and mountains that we have here in the Ishu region, because it's like everything here is surrounded by mountains and ravines. So the thing is that there are people living on the borders of those ravines and mountains. And when you have the landslides, people lives are exposed very quickly, and there have happened already a couple of people that have died because of that. And then we had this water floods all around. A lot of crops have been lost, and also the whole infrastructure has been damaged. There are a lot of communities that are without of communication at this point, and some of them have no access to any food or clean water or anything. So there is like this big problem because the question is how will it be possible to help these communities if we don't have any road or anything that eventually can allow to provide some humanitarian aid. And beyond that, we have also had some problems with the governmental aid. Everything is catastrophic here when it is related with the government. The local municipal alcaldía, which is like the formal representation of the government, a couple of weeks ago was making some trouble, trying to we are not sure what they were trying to do, but making things difficult. But luckily, on the other hand, at least here in Neva, where am I now, there is the Alcaldía Indígena, or the Indigenous Authority, Ancestral Authority, that started a process of, collecting food, clothes, medicine, everything that eventually all these people that are isolated could receive and, provide some aid.
Thank you for giving us that update. Obviously, the situation is concerning. What we've seen in Guatemala is that the majority of people who have been impacted by these two hurricanes and the aftermath tend to be indigenous peoples. As Alejandro, you were mentioning, I also have friends in the Ishu region who talk about the crops that have been damaged, right? So if there were starvation now because of historical violence and lack of access to land, I think the future looks a little bit grim in terms of the crops that were lost. So could you speak a little bit about kind of what people are saying in terms of the damages to the crops and things like that?
Yeah, the thing is that this is not only a damage that is taking place at this moment. this is a damage that is going to last for a couple of years, because all these agricultural cycles are working in such a way that people are, seeding food for the next 6 months or the next year. So when you have such a damage for the crops, people get really scared because at least, they can have some supplies stashed at home, but eventually they know that those supplies are going to run out. And when that happens, if the crops of this year are damaged, like the great question and the very scary question is, what are they going to do? Because they're not going to have anything to eat after a while. And that's for the people who are, like in a safe position at this moment, that didn't lose their homes or anything. Because you have, on the other hand, those who lost their houses, who lost their animals, their crops and everything, and now at this point they are without anything.
Alejandro, switching gears a little bit, could you speak a little bit about what's going on now in regards to the protests? Could you elaborate a little bit more about kind of this historical moment that we're living in? Like, kind of talking about previous protests in the past, whether they're student movements, indigenous movements, or campesino movements, and how that relates to resistance movements today. So could you kind of elaborate a little bit more about what's going on today?
Yeah, definitely, Gio. I think it's very important to pay attention to this aspect that you are underlying, are remarking at this moment. When you say that we have a long tradition, sort of speaking, a long history of social movements and resistance, is actually a fact. If you analyze, how this is what some people call the motines de indios during the colonial time here in Guatemala. You could find that almost a motín de indio, like a mutiny in a pueblo de indios took place almost on the every week basis, and then you had like eventual insurrections that were more organized, like the Rebelión de los Andales, and then you have other expressions of resistance that you can, date them like very, very long ago here in Guatemala. So one of the things that is very important to pay attention to is that the resistance here, an organized resistance, is nothing new. It is something that always has existed here in Guatemala and always has been very strongly repressed by the state before, in the beginning by the colonial state powers, and now by this Republican, oligarch state powers. So one of the things that I think is mostly important to pay attention to is that after the coup that we have in the 1950s, after 1954, a whole resistance movement that started in different places of the country. Some of them were ideologically Marxist leaned. Others had like a more peasant ideology in terms of how they structure their political discourse and their demands. And others had also a religious manifestation that was coming from the liberation theology and all these branches of Catholicism that eventually radicalized and took a stand for the people, defending the people's rights and defending the possibility of the people to recover what was taken from them during, the colonization process and during the installation of what we here in Guatemala call the finca state. The finca in the 19th century, we had massive land expropriations from the state and all this land was later given to private owners. Most of them were criollos or hero Guatemalans, Guatemalans that are descendants from Europeans. Most of them whites, or at least they are reivindicating that they have a white identity or white, blood running through their veins, and they make the whole thing of creating this genealogical trees, to see where their roots are in specific places of Europe, specifically in Spain or Germany. So one of the things that you can see is that historically these struggles had a racial component, in terms of how people have been abused by the state and how this abuse has translated in giving privileges to white people in Guatemala. So that's one of the things that I consider is very interesting to understand when we talk about the history of struggle and resistance here in the country. The other thing is specifically with these popular indigenous insurrections. When we're talking or thinking, for instance, here in the Ixil region, you can see that in the 1970s and the 1980s, there was some sort of indigenous insurrection of the Ixilers. They were like struggling in the same terms for, recovering the rights that were taken when in the 19th century the Finca state was founded. And also, to develop or to create a country or a state in which the relations were not such, unequal and racist as what we have here. So that's one of the parts I consider very important. The other part is that I was telling you that you had like different expressions, and for instance, in urban areas, specifically in Guatemala City, in the 1960s. You had also history of social movements, student movements that were very important. For instance, in the 62, you had this thing that we call de jornadas de marzo y abril del 62. Large group of students and working class young people started to protest against authoritarian government that we had back in the day, and we still have some sort of authoritarian government. And one of the things that took place is that the government repressed those expressions of resistance. They were like, we could make some equivalence and say there were some sort of civil rights movement, very focused in urban areas. Something like what we can see with the Black Lives Matter, or what we can see the environmental movement, but with different kinds of claims and different kinds of social demands that were more related to like reconstructing and recovering what was taken in the 1954 coup that was, by the way, committed by, the local oligarchy, this white criollo oligarchy, with the help of the United States government, the CIA, and the national military. So the biggest demand at the moment was to recreate the democracy that happened, in that decade between 1944 and 1954.
In thinking about Guatemala, Guatemala tends to be a very, when you live in Guatemala, when you work in Guatemala, you could come out with a very fatalistic feeling. One of the things that I wanted to ask you is, thinking about this history, this long tradition of resistance that you laid out there within the last couple of centuries, the protests that are going on now, is what future do you envision for Guatemala?
Yeah, I try to be optimistic, even though there is almost nothing to hang to be optimistic, But I think, pessimism can be, a slippery slope, and it can be very, very dangerous in terms of how people can get demoralized and how people can stop thinking of the value of, political struggles. But of course, one of the things that make me optimistic is to see, how there are some political and economical debates taking place here in the Ixil region. We have talked a little bit in other moments about this concept they are proposing of the Tichahiltenam, which is some sort of concept they are developing. They had the concept of the Tichahiltenam entrenched in the culture, that was heard during the war, and that was heard during the introduction of the Finca state and everything. But the whole point of the Tichahiltenam is to create, being, not necessarily in the way that the Bolivianos put it of el buen vivir, but creating a life that is in some sort of balance with the environment. And when we're talking about the environment, I mean, when they are talking about the environment, they are not only talking about human environment, but also with a more broader conception of environment regarding or taking in consideration, for instance, the relationships that humans have with nature. So I think that eventually, if these indigenous ideas become more politicized, can eventually create a different country. As I say, we are always like trying to, or very tempted to make the comparison with Bolivia, because there is a lot of similarities in a plenty number of things. But the thing is that as long as this country is not putting in the middle all this plurality of political or philosophical ideas that indigenous peoples have, I think this country is never going to be really democratic. So I think that if we are trying to be positive, one of the drives of positivity must be to think how are we going to construct and to create a democracy. But to create a democracy is not going to be thinking only like in the liberal Western European understanding of democracy, but instead a different kind of democracy that is rising from the political ancestral knowledges and forms of organizing ancestral authority. So, I think that should be the future, But you have seen that. You've been here. You have collaborated a lot with local indigenous authorities. So one of the big questions, and that's probably a very Leninist question, is how? I mean, probably we know what to do. Probably we say, okay, el qué hacer, what to do is something where we have a more or less clear. The big question is how are we going to do these things? How are we going to make these transformations in politics, in economy, and in the whole structure of social relations that we have in this country, where we are still inheriting. We still have this inheritance of colonial racism, 19th century racist liberalism, and all these big powers that are either trenches, in El Casif, which is, where actually all the oligarchs in Guatemala are organizing in a union of big bosses. They're not necessarily criminal bosses because they are acting within the margins of the law, but they are ruling over the country without being having been elected.
Thank you, Alejandro, for your time. We really appreciate your perspective on all of this. I just wanted to leave you with the final word, and that's basically, what message do you have for the people listening? How can people support the efforts of the Ixil Maya in Guatemala, or even the protesters who are rising up against a very corrupt government? So do you have any final words for listeners, or just kind of ways people could contribute to any of these efforts that you're mentioning?
I think, the most immediate thing is probably to support the fundraisings. Some people are moving, and you have a couple of fundraisings to help people that are being affected immediately because of the tropical storms and hurricanes that we're having at the moment. As I told you before, the most important thing at this point is how are we going to prevent that in the next year we're going to have a starvation in this region, because the crops are being ruined, really, really badly. So we need to see how to react to those things. And the other things that eventually we can think, but more in the middle or the long term, is how to we can aid to develop these initiatives, such as the Ixil University, probably creating more strong networks of relations between, for instance, local indigenous organizations that then eventually can contribute in making these experiences as what they are doing in the Ixil University more strong and have a more significant impact, in the region, but also in the country and internationally.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Alejandro. And it's always a pleasure to talk to you. So thanks a lot for your time. And with that, we've come to the end of the show. I just want to thank our three invited guests, Andrea Ishu, Florida Lopez, and Alejandro Flores, for taking time out of their day to join us and share their experiences and analysis of the current political situation in Guatemala. Muchas gracias. Thank you. Maldios.